The first Americans were not who we thought they were. For decades, we thought the first humans to arrive in the Americas came across the Bering Land Bridge 13,000 years ago. New evidence has changed that picture. During the last ice age, humans ventured into two vast and completely unknown continents, North and South America. For nearly a century, researchers thought they knew how this wild journey occurred. The first people to cross the Bering Land Bridge, a massive swath of land that connected Asia with North America, when sea levels were much lower, were the Clovis culture, who made the journey shortly before 13,000 years ago. And we know 13,000 years ago was also the comet impact on Earth, the Younger Dryas era. And now, according to the Clovis first theory, every indigenous person in the Americas could be traced to the single inland migration, said Lauren Davis, professor of anthropology, Oregon State University. But in recent decades, several discoveries have revealed that humans first reached the so-called New World thousands of years before we initially thought, and probably did not get there by an inland route. So where were the first Americans from? How did and when did they arrive? Genetic studies suggest the first people who arrived in the Americas descended from an ancestral group of ancient North Siberians and East Asians that mingled around 20,000 to 23,000 years ago. They crossed the Bering Land Bridge sometime between then and 15,500 years ago, said David Meltzer, archaeologist and professor of prehistory in the Department of Anthropology at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, and author of the book First Peoples in the New World, second edition. But some archaeologists cite hints that people may have reached the Americas far earlier than that. For instance, there are fossilized human footprints in White Sands National Park in New Mexico that may date to 21,000 to 23,000 years ago. And that would mean humans arrived in North America during the last glacial maximum LGM, which occurred between about 26,500 to 19,000 years ago, when ice sheets covered much of what is now Alaska, Canada, and northern United States. Other more equivocal data suggests the first people arrived in the Western Hemisphere 25,000 or even 31,500 years ago. If these dates can be confirmed, they would paint a much more complex picture of how and when humans reached the Americas. Almost all scientists agree, however, that this incredible journey was made possible by the emergence of Beringia, a now submerged 1,100-mile wide landmass that connected what is now Alaska and the Russian Far East. During the last ice age, much of Earth's water was frozen in ice sheets, causing ocean levels to be much lower than they are today. Beringia surfaced once waters in the North Pacific dropped roughly 164 feet below today's level. It was passable by foot between 30,000 and 12,000 years ago, Meltzer and S.K. Willerslev, geneticist, University of Cambridge, wrote in 2021 review, journal Nature. From there, the archaeological picture gets muddier. The older version of the story originated in the 1920s and 30s, when Western archaeologists discovered sharp-edged, leaf-shaped stone spear points near Clovis, New Mexico. The people who made them, now dubbed the Clovis people, lived in North America between 13,000 and 12,700 years ago, based on a 2020 analysis of bone, charcoal, and plant remains from the Clovis sites. At the time, it was thought that the Clovis traveled across Beringia and then moved through an ice-free corridor or a gap between the continental ice sheets in what is now part of Alaska and Canada. Davis, who leads excavations at the ancient North America site in Coopers Ferry, Idaho, told Life Science. Once they exited, they spread quickly throughout the Americas, bearing a signature stone tool known as the Clovis spear point, which was likely used to hunt megafauna, big animals such as mammoths and bison, as well as a smaller game. And for decades, it was challenging to suggest the first Americans arrived any earlier than 13,000 years ago. Slowly, however, new discoveries began turning back the clock on the first Americans' arrival. In 1976, researchers learned about the site of Monte Verde in South Chile, which radiocarbon dating showed us about 14,550 years ago, 50 years old, and it took decades for the archaeologists to accept the dating of Monte Verde, but soon other sites also published back the date. They pushed back the date of humans' arrival in the Americas. The Paisley Caves in Oregon contain human coprolites, that is, of course, their SHIT, or fossilized poop, dating to about 14,500 years ago. Page Ladson, a pre-Clovis site in Florida, with stone tools and mastodon bones, dates to about 14,550 years ago. And Cooper's Ferry, a site that includes stone tools, animal bones, and charcoal, dates to around 16,000 years ago. Then in 2021, scientists announced much more ancient traces of human occupation, fossilized footprints in White Sands, New Mexico, dating to between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago. There are dozens more sites, although some of the older ones are controversial. For instance, some archaeologists said 31,500 years old rocks in a remote Mexican cave were stone tools made by humans, but a rebuttal argued that the rocks got their shapes naturally. Another site in Brazil holds giant sloth bones that may have been modified by humans at least 25,000 years ago, but a narrow hole in the bones could have occurred naturally, Davis said. And 50,000-year-old stone tools in Pedra Furada, Brazil, may have actually been made by capuchin monkeys, a 2022 study in the journal The Holocene found. Such sites as White Sands and Cooper's Ferry have big implications for how the first people arrived in the Americas. It's thought that the ice-free corridor through North America did not fully open until about 13,800 years ago. So if humans were in the Americas long before then, they likely traveled there along the Pacific coast. That coastal journey could have been made by foot, by watercraft, or both, but no fossil or archaeological evidence of this journey has been unearthed. Davis said, "We've never found a boat, we've never found a submerged site out on a 16,000-year-old shoreline in British Columbia." Well, it may be underwater, that's why they didn't find them. Now still, because let's remember that at those times the sea level was 160 feet lower than what it is today. So all these areas, if these people lived near coasts, these settlements must be underwater right now. Now, despite these uncertainties, researchers have ruled out some of the wildest theories. For instance, the first Americans were not Pacific Islanders who boated across the open ocean, because people did not migrate to Polynesia until around 3,000 years ago, and genetic evidence shows that the first Americans are only very distantly related to Polynesians. Likewise, genetic studies ruled out the Solutrean hypothesis, which posits that Paleolithic Europeans came across the Atlantic around 20,000 years ago, according to the 2021 Nature Review. Geneticists studying the first Americans tend to paint a more consistent picture than archaeologists do, mainly because they're using the same human remains and genetic datasets. Genetic analysis found that ancient North Siberians and a group of East Asians paired up around 20,000 to 23,000 years ago. Jennifer Raft, Associate Professor of Anthropology, University of Kansas, author of the book Origin, A Genetic History of the Americas, wrote in 2022. Soon after, the population split into two genetically distinct groups, one that stayed in Siberia and another, the basal American branch, which emerged around 20,000 to 21,000 years ago. Genetic data suggests the descendants of this basal American branch crossed the Bering Land Bridge and became the first Americans. The basal American branch then split into three groups: unsampled population A, UPOP-A, a mysterious genetic ghost that has only been detected indirectly from the genomes of the Mexi of what is now Mexico. Raff said, ancient Beringians who have no known living descendants, an ancient Native American ANA whose descendants live on today. All three of these groups ultimately made it to North America, but their diverging genetics suggests that they crossed in separate movements, Metzler and Willerslev wrote in a review. Some did not make it very far. The ancient Beringians entered Alaska but never made it south to the continental ice sheets, south of the sheets. The last known ancient Beringian, known as the Trail Creek individual, died around 9,000 years ago in Alaska. Meanwhile, the ANA line underwent several splits, suggesting that these people settled in different areas of North America as they had limited gene flow between them, Raff said. There was one split between 21,000 and 16,000 years ago, and then a second one around 15,700 years ago. And during this second split, the northern Native Americans, whose living descendants include speakers of the Algonquin, Salishan, Tishian, and Na-Dene language groups, separated from the southern Native Americans, SNA, who spread southward and whose descendants include the Clovis, Raff said. Every known living and deceased indigenous individual south of Canada belonged to the SNA, Raff said, the southern Native Americans. And ideally, archaeologists would like to find more sites from all of these branches, especially any remains that could explain the genetics behind the people at White Sands between 23,000 and 21,000 years ago. Right now, I'm really eager to find evidence that reconciles the presence of people at White Sands during LGM and the genetic signature of migration that seems to have occurred later, Raff said, as well as sites from eastern Beringia that can help us better understand the movement of people through that region. But that's a challenging task. For one, when archaeologists do uncover exceptionally preserved sites, they find that upwards of 90% of what people made and used was perishable. It's plant fiber, it's feathers, it's animal skins and the like, said Edward Joly, Associate Professor of Anthropology, University of Arizona. Such organic artifacts or remains typically preserve well only in rare circumstances, extremely wet, dry, or cold places such as caves, rock shelters, or waterlogged sites, he said. Even if there were other well-preserved organic material-rich sites waiting to be discovered, many scientists are not looking for them. Instead, they are stuck in a Clovis mindset, hunting for the stone tools ancient people crafted, said Matthew Bennett, Professor of Environmental Geographical Science at Bournemouth University, UK. But evidence of these long-lost people can also be found in the remains of the animals they butchered, the charcoal they burned, the tools they crafted, and the loved ones they buried. Bennett and his colleagues are focused on the fossilized footprints these ancient individuals left behind, and the field won't move forward until more archaeologists focus on such evidence, Bennett said. There are other types of evidence other than stone tools, he said. And this is by Laura Gegel on Live Science. Please leave your comments, and thank you for your support. My Patreon account, the daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.